Good morning, Mr. Pretorius. Good morning, everybody.
Morning, Chair. Chair, may we commence with the application for condonation, which will be presented to you by Advocate Gigaba,
Yes.
and then Ms. Hofmeyer will lead Ms. Carolus.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning again, Chair.
Morning, Ms. Gigaba.
My task, Chair, is simply to move an application for condonation in respect to the failure by the Commission's legal team, which really is the Commission, to comply with Rule 3.3 of the Commission's rules governing the proceedings of this Commission. There are two applications, Chairman, that I am moving this morning. One, in respect of Advocate Ramatlodi's statement and the Rule 3.3 that was eventually issued in terms of that statement, and then also one in relation to Advocate Mufe. I'll start with the one relating to Advocate Ramatlodi, which starts off, the notice of motion is on page 5 of your bundle, Chairman.
Yes.
Chairman, this essentially is a condonation application in relation to timeframes that are prescribed in our rules. What is envisaged in Rule 3.3 is that implicated persons will be given 14 days notice. The rule speaks to reasonable time, but the convention has been that they will receive 14 days notice to enable them to respond or elect to respond in whichever manner they would want to respond. Chairman,
Yes.
The notice of motion, therefore, that I speak to seeks relief in terms of prayers 1, 2, and 3 thereof, because the Commission failed to serve that Rule 3.3 notice on former President Jacob Zuma within the prescribed timeframes. I just want to point out, Chair, that that notice of motion does notify any implicated person of the terms of Rule 3.5, which, Chairman, you know, allows an implicated party to approach you for the relief envisioned there. It also,
Yes.
Chairman, is brought in terms of the rules, which means that the condonation application was served on the implicated person, Chairman, and that can be found on page 27, if you would like to verify that the condonation application itself was served, page 27 of your papers, and the Rule 3.3 itself, the proof of service is on page 22. All is in order, Chairman. I'd like to point out that all the other parties who are implicated persons in this matter were served with timeous notices.
Yes.
And
Okay.
they were also served with the condonation application.
Yes.
I've got the dates here,
Yes.
Chairman.
Yes.
The only small little error we've made is in not including the proof of service on Mr. Mani.
Yes.
But I am
he
assured
was
that he was served with that.
Oh, okay.
Yes, Chairman.
Okay.
Chairman, just very briefly, the reasonable explanation that accompanies the affidavit of our attorney of record
Yes.
is that when the legal team had a look at these papers in preparing for the hearing, we realized that though President Zuma was not directly implicated, because his name was mentioned, out of an abundance of caution, it was better to actually serve him with a
Yes.
notice, just in case
Yes.
what came out of the mouth of the witness
Yes.
dug a bit of a hole and showed that he is directly and substantially affected or implicated.
Yeah.
That's the long and short of it, Chairman. You know that we have set out in the affidavit those reasons. Prejudice, Chairman, is very limited. He has had 7 days' notice. He does have an attorney who has placed himself on record.
Yeah.
We believe there is no prejudice to him at all.
Yeah.
And in the circumstances, Chairman, I move for an order in terms of prayers 1, 2, and 3 of the notice of motion in respect of the Ramatlhodi matter.
I grant prayers 1, 2, and 3 in the notice of motion.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, similarly with Advocate Mufe's statement, the facts are slightly different. The parties were given 7 days' notice instead of the 14 days' notice that we have followed as a convention. All of them in this instance, all the implicated persons had not been served with their 3-3 notices. So they have been given those 3-3 notices, Chairman, and it's apparent from the papers where the proof of service is. I don't know if you'd like me to go through, but with all of them, Chairman, the 3-3s were served on the 21st of November, and then the condemnation application was served on the 23rd of November in respect of all of them. In this instance, Mr. Zwane is added to these implicated persons, whereas he wasn't added to the ones who Advocate Ramatlhodi's statement referred to.
Yes.
Chairman, again, in terms of the facts really relate to the Advocate Mufe and Mr. Mabunda trying to find each other just to start preparing the initial statements. When they eventually came to the legal team, there were a couple of gremlins which we thought might create confusion, and we decided we'd rather clean those up than put out a statement that would cause consternation for implicated parties. And that's essentially what we've set out in the affidavit, Chairman.
Yeah.
Other than that, Chair, I'd like to point out that the legal representatives of Dr. Ngubane and those of Mr. Duduzane Zuma have indicated in letters, I have copies here if you'd like to have copies, Chairman, that they reserve their rights to approach you in terms of Rule 35 to pursue whatever rights they think they might wish to pursue once they've read the transcripts and consulted with their clients.
Yeah.
In the circumstances, Chair, if you're satisfied, I move for an order in terms of prayers 1, 2, and 3 of the notice of motion attached to this application.
I grant prayers 1, 2, and 3 of the notice of motion.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Yes, Ms. Hofmeyer.
Chair, today we have the evidence of Ms. Cheryl Carolus. Before we have the witness sworn in, there is 1 or 2 aspects of housekeeping, and then a general submission I propose to make in relation to the relevance of the evidence to the terms of reference of this commission. If I may deal with those 2 matters initially.
Yes.
Chair, in relation to housekeeping matters, I can inform you that the relevant Rule 3.3 notices arising from Ms. Carolus' statement were issued timeously, and in respect of those 3 notices that were issued, there have been no applications for cross-examination.
Okay.
In terms of sketching the relevance of the evidence today, Chair, as the legal team has it, there are 4 broad aspects of relevance in Ms. Carolus' evidence today. The first of those relates to setting the scene of the state of South African Airways at the time that Ms. Carolus took over as chairperson in 2009, and the state in which she and her board left the airline in 2012. We submit that story as of critical relevance to the work of this commission, because what Ms. Carolus' evidence will show is the extent to which, in that period of 3 years, that board made substantial strides in turning around SAA, in getting an effective management team in place, and in the course of those 3 years, resisting external pressure and undue influence in relation to the management of the entity. It is critical to set that story because the evidence that will be led in due course when the details of the SAA position after this board's resignation in 2012 is presented, will show how this board's plans to rescue the airline, to take it forward, to ensure good governance and appropriate management systems being in place, then came to naught. And so the first important aspect is the setting the scene for the evidence that will come.
Okay.
The second important aspect is what Ms. Carolus can tell us about the Mumbai route. She's both a corroborative witness there in relation to the evidence that's previously been presented by witnesses, and she takes that story further.
Yes.
The third aspect are the indications of the pressure that was placed on SAA to place its advertising spend with the new age, and the extent to which that was resisted by her board and the management that were in place. And then finally, to deal with the events surrounding the mass resignation of 8 members of the board, which Ms. Carolus chaired at the end of their term. That event itself shows, in the words of Ms. Carolus in her statement, what seemed to amount to events of a constructive dismissal type, which would pave the way for a more compliant board.
Yeah.
So, Chair, it's against the background of those 4 areas of relevance that we present the evidence of Ms. Carolus today. If I may request that she be sworn in.
Yes. Thank you.
Please state your full names for the record.
My name is Cheryl and Carolus.
Do you have any objection with making the prescribed affirmation?
No, I do not.
Do you solemnly affirm that the evidence you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please state, I truly affirm.
I truly affirm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Carolus.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Chair, for the purposes of the record, I propose that we number Ms. Carolus's evidence bundle R. That, as I have it, is the next in the sequence.
Don't we already have R?
Do you already have R?
I seem to think we do have R. I may be mistaken.
As I have it, we concluded on Q yesterday,
Oh, is that
so
so?
R would be the next.
Oh, it's P that we have P. Maybe
Indeed.
Maybe P looked like an R to me.
P snuck its way in. Today we have R. So if
Yeah.
I may propose the...
So this will be the bundle that has got Ms. Carolus' statement will be marked Exhibit R. Thank you.
And then just to orientate you, Ms. Carolus, in terms of what is in front of you, you have a copy of R, and there is also a copy of another evidence bundle, N2, to which I will make reference in the course of your evidence. Ms. Carolus, I understand from our discussions previously that there are 1 or 2 aspects of your statement which commences at page 1 of bundle R, in respect of which you would like to make corrections. My proposal, Chair, is to deal with those corrections as we reach them in the evidence, because it is useful to place them in context.
Whichever, that's fine. If it's convenient to point them out at the beginning, that can be done. If it's more convenient to deal with them as we reach the particular aspect of her evidence, that's fine. So it's fine.
Thank you, Chair. My proposal is that we do it as we reach them in the evidence. Ms. Carolus, if I could take you to page 1 of your, of Exhibit R, which is the first page of your statement. And if we go in that bundle to page 29, can you confirm that that is your signature on page 29?
I confirm so.
And that this is the statement that you prepared from pages 1 to 29 for your evidence today?
I can confirm that too.
Thank you. And but for the 2 corrections we'll come to, do you confirm the contents of that statement as true and correct?
I do.
Thank you. Ms. Carolus, if we can commence your evidence today with the background that you brought with you when you commenced as chair of South African Airways in 2009. Can you sketch for us where you came from and what you did before you entered SAA?
Thank you, and good morning properly, Chairperson.
And good morning,
and,
Ms. Carolus.
and to the House.
Thank you.
I want to just start off by saying that I believe I'm part of a very lucky generation of people in South Africa. I'm old enough to have lived through all the horrors of not only institutionalized but legalized racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry. I grew up under a system of apartheid that I think was neo-fascist and that really thrived on hatred and division. And being old enough to have lived through the full horrors of that and still seeing the consequences, I am very determined that I will never allow history to repeat itself on my watch. I am also old enough to carry the scars of having been an active participant in the struggle to end apartheid. And I carry those scars as a badge of honor, the scars of detentions, of torture, of banning orders, of numerous forms of restriction. But I'm also very proud to be part of a generation who's young enough to build a very different future for my country. I was born to poor parents on the Cape Flats, who were the first generation of families who were forcibly removed under the Group Areas Act. And I saw the consequences of that, and much of that is still prevalent in my community and indeed in our society. I joined my first political organization at the age of 13, and it was really the only way that a young black angry girl child could counter a system that seeked to make me complicit in my own oppression. I spent my entire teenage years, and indeed my adult life, consumed by militant participation and defiance of apartheid through protests and through building organizations, democratic organizations, much of which remains still today. I have held leadership positions in student organizations and in the women's movement during the years of apartheid. And like many South Africans, I was inspired and drawn and given hope by the politics of the ANC of building a South Africa that was non-racial, non-sexist, and democratic. I served in the leadership of the United Democratic Front, which was an alliance of anti-apartheid civil society organizations during the years the ANC was banned. And at the unbanning of the ANC, I was elected onto an interim leadership of both the ANC and the SACP when those organizations were unbanned. An element of huge pride for me today still is I was elected to be part of the ANC's first delegation that met with the then President de Klerk and his team to discuss how we would go into the talks about holding talks in South Africa. And I should say, Chairperson, the enormous pride I felt at the time of being part of a delegation that was so diverse and so much, represented so much of the vision for the future. On our side of the table, and it was literally a table led by by Nelson Mandela, was a group of black people, white people, young people, older people, women, men, Christians, atheists, Muslims, Jews. And the other side of the table was a group of very aged white men from very similar backgrounds. And it's a moment of great pride for me because it represented where we wanted to take our country. I was also part of that processes of the team who did the negotiations. And I remember so much, and often when I feel disturbed about what's going on in our country, I get very angry with people still who say our country is worse than it was under apartheid, because it is not, even at the moment with some of our concerns. Because I remember a time when we were straddling negotiations and where tens of people were killed just routinely every day in our townships as we were negotiating. I remember the murder of Chris Hani, someone I was very close to and respected deeply, and his family. I remember how we had to pick up body parts of people who were slaughtered on trains every day. I remember Boy Patong and how I was part of the ANC leadership who had to go in there after that massacre and rapes of women in households that those soldiers moved through. And so it was with enormous pride and achievement that Nelson Mandela was sworn in, and that we were associated with his example of enormous integrity and humility with which he served our country. I was one of small group. In fact, I was the only member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC who decided to not make myself available for any parliamentary positions.
I'm sorry, just repeat that. I didn't.
I think I was the only National Executive Committee member of the ANC who actively decided to not stand for any parliamentary positions. But I'm at great pains to say I then and still remain very, very concerned about who runs our country in Parliament, because it is such an important role of trust that people are entitled to or given. So whilst not in formal parliamentary service, I, over a number of years, served in a number of functions to help government, and mostly unpaid functions. I served on a commission with the First Minister of Education to look at what happens with our higher institutions. I've served in a number of capacities in chairing South African National Parks Board, and I can go on and on at both national and provincial level of various ways in which I've supported our governments, our newly elected governments, to navigate that space. I've also served in a number of non-governmental organizations, particularly in the areas of young people at risk, such as Soul City, Love Life. I have served in organizations of biodiversity. I served at the international boards of WWF and WWF South Africa, and feel quite proud of how we've transformed those spaces. I also serve on international body dealing with international conflict prevention. And I can say that I feel honored to have served in organizations associated with the fights around HIV and AIDS in our country when people did not have access to those. I've also served in organizations that deals with gender violence, and have been a strong voice around rape, including that of our former president, when many people were scared to do so or felt we would be compromising the ANC. And I must say, Chairperson, I'm deeply disturbed by the events over the past 10 years or so in our country. And initially, I think we were quite, and I used an analogy once when I wrote an open letter to then President Jacob Zuma, of the toad in the pot syndrome, where there's a candle burning under it, where you just adapt and you adapt your levels of tolerance until you finally realize you've reached boiling point. But also, I must say, Chairperson, that I do think that there was a very strong view amongst us as ANC members of we would harm the organization and by implication the country if we spoke out. So I was part of a very august group of people that I am very junior in, calling themselves the stalwarts and veterans of the ANC, who made presentations over a period of about 2 years to the leadership of the ANC, to in fact say that to express our concern. And it fell largely on deaf ears by the then leadership of the ANC. But I was also proud to have been part of a handful of ANC leaders who, at the court ruling, the Constitutional Court ruling on Nkandla, felt we had to speak out on the steps of the Constitutional Court. And many people were quite critical of us doing that because they felt we would harm our organization that we loved so dearly. I hold a very different view. I believe that I'm in the ANC because I believe I want an ANC that can serve my country and not serve itself. Because the freedom that we have today to vote and to have a constitutional court and a constitution came at a huge cost, and that it's a matter of luck that we are here. So I believe that we were perilously close to an abyss, and that there's much work still to be done, and which is why I am here today, Chairperson, to in fact participate and share my learnings and experiences in the hope that as a nation we can just realize how much work there is to be done and how perilously we actually took our country back to the brink of the abyss. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for what may be called an opening remarks. But basically what you were doing is you were telling us more about what you have done as a South African over the years in your life to make a contribution to the country, and And what you have said is quite important. So I must thank you once again for coming forward to give evidence. We really appreciate it. You have touched on an issue that is important, namely that when certain events were happening in the country, there would be a view within the ruling party held by some that maybe speaking out on certain issues would harm the party, and that some might feel that they should not speak out publicly, and that you hold a different view. Now, it may well be that that issue is still there in relation to certain people coming forward to assist this commission. It may be that there are past and present cabinet ministers, directors general, and other government officials who have knowledge of information that would be very useful for the work of this commission, but who are not coming forward to assist the commission and assist the country because they feel that they may be harming or would be harming the party. I would have thought that an organization such as the ANC was established in order to bring about a certain type of South Africa, and that therefore the country would come first, and that if you are going to speak out in order to make sure that you contribute to ensuring that the country is on the right path to where it should go, you should not have a problem, and that nobody should have a problem with that from the ruling party. So what you have touched on is very important, but I just hope that more and more people who may be staying away from coming forward to assist the commission, look at this and reflect on whether the party wasn't established in order to help the country to take a certain direction in order to create a certain acceptable society. And that if things happen in the country which seems to have the result that the country deviates from the right path, they should come forward and contribute to bringing the country back to the right path. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Chair.
Ms. Hofmeyer.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Carolus, if we can go to page 1 of Exhibit R at paragraph 2. You talk there about your initial appointment to the board of SAA as chairperson on the 28th of September 2009. You were appointed together with a number of members of the board, and you traverse who they are over the page at page 2. What I'd like you to give the chair a sense of is the levels of skills, expertise, and experience amongst the board members who were appointed with you in the course of 2009.
Thank you, ma'am. As I said, I think there was a lot of thought that went into it, and I discovered subsequently a lot of people who served on the board with me all felt equally strongly as I did at the time when approached by Minister Hogan that we would only do this because of our love for our country. We understood SAA was on very shaky grounds, but we would also only do that if we felt they were the right people with the right reputations and the right levels of skill. And maybe if I can just go through ourselves. I mean, as I said, my own background is I've had the privilege to be able to speak for myself a bit. I can also just say that I had served in other capacities I had served as South Africa's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, which is one of our most important missions. I do think that I can say, at the risk of sounding immoderate, that I think I did a reasonably good job in raising South Africa's profile, in building our trade, in building our people-to-peoples, and so on. Upon my return, I was the CEO of South African Tourism, and I'm very proud of the fact that we turned it around quite significantly, and particularly to turn it into a proper sector. And that meant working with all the stakeholders, including, of course, South African Airways, and aligning the work of tourism with that of trade and industry, with that of our foreign relations, and indeed the role of our national carrier played a very important role. So I got to understand that quite a bit. I'll just go through the list just so that I don't skip over anyone. Ms. Hogan put together, there's a person, Mr. Abel Bouchon, who subsequently resigned in midterm. For no other reason, he lived in Chile, and it just became a bit of a nightmare, but he stayed with us while we were in the formative period of it. Mr. Bouchon had been a CEO of the Chilean national carrier. He was at that stage the chief executive of Coca-Cola in Chile, and had served on a number of big companies. Mr. Teddy Daka, and you're right, people's resumes are far too small. He's in fact an accomplished businessman who owns businesses that are global, and in fact one of his businesses deals with the defense industry and manufacturing parts for components for the aircraft use in defense industries. Today his company is one of the largest black ones listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, some of the things he's associated with. Mr. Tukela Jankis is in fact today still he heads up a very successful rural dairy farming project out in the Eastern Cape. He had, what's not in his CV is that he was actually a shop steward in his life, and in fact was the chairperson of the Boksburg Civic during the struggle years, but had gone on and got into management and HR functions. Ms. Yake Kwinana is a chartered accountant, and is in fact had her own company, Kwinana and Associates, which is still existing, and she had served on a number of government bodies and so on. Ms. Kwinana, as I said, was a chartered accountant with degrees in computer science as well. Mr. Russell Loubser, at the time, was the CEO of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which, as we know, had, I think, for 8 years running, won the best award for the best run stock exchange in the world, himself a business person, and served in a number of capacities there. Mr. Bonang Mohale, at that stage was a member of SA Express, which Minister Hogan in particular, and those of us who served, felt had to create better alignment with SAA. He was also quite an important person in the whole sphere of marketing and communications in South Africa. And he was the president of Shell, South Africa at the time, and served on a number of other business capacities. Ms. Duduzile Mieni herself was somebody who was the chair of the Jacob Zuma Foundation at that stage, had done quite a lot of community associations that she was associated with, and was in fact somebody who was studying in the field of administration and had been a teacher, but had also served on a few state-owned entities and their boards. Mr. Jabu Ndlovu was at that stage the executive for Microsoft South Africa, and was quite a seasoned people and skills development person, and had for a few years then won for Microsoft South Africa the best employer to work for. And at that stage there was the situation at the staffing level was very fractious and quite bad at South African Airways. Advocate Lindy Thomas was a practicing advocate in the court, and in fact a seasoned commercial lawyer and somebody working in the field of litigation. Mr. Louis Rabetz had done quite a lot of work in the field of forensics and corporate governance, and particularly in the areas of risk. It served in a number of government, both government, but also big corporates like Sanlam in those capacities around the risk. And he comes with actuarial science qualifications. Mr. Zakele Sitole, who's late today, also chartered accountant, was one of the first, I think one of the first 8 black chartered accountants that qualified in South Africa, and had served, done enormous, the most extraordinary civil service right up till his death. He had served, at that stage he was still serving on the audit functions of the Treasury, the PIC, and in fact universities and so on. There was Ms. Margie Whitehouse, who was a marketer of note, and in fact herself had very good qualifications and experience in that work. Worked for some of the top global and South African companies. And then there were a few other people who joined the board, one of whom was Mr. Dave Lewis, who's not in the list of that we have, I think. Mr. Lewis had in fact served as a leader in the trade union movement throughout the 80s, and in fact built the non-racial trade union movement, but he had just retired at that point as the head of the Competition Commission in South Africa, and as you know, that was one of the areas where there was a lot of problems for SAA. I think I've covered everyone. I'm not going to cover the executives because they were employed for their skills. Maybe what I can just conclude with, Chairperson, is to say that Minister Hogan appointed initially 9 of us, and then in discussion with myself as the chair, and me in discussion with the rest of the board, as we realized what the challenges were that was facing us, we subsequently, she then appointed members like Mr. Lewis, who was clearly seasoned when we realized the quantum of the challenge that we were dealing with, hundreds of millions of rands worth of litigation in the areas of competition, and some very bad practices in that area.
Thank you.
Okay, before Ms. Hofmeyer continues, I'm just checking that people at the back are hearing everything. There are nods. Okay, thank you. And then, Ms. Carolus, I seem to remember that, you didn't mention it, but I seem to remember that at some stage you were also the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC, am I right? Or were you the Secretary General?
No, you are correct, Chairperson. I was the first woman elected into the top 5 leadership positions in the ANC, and I did indeed serve with great pride at the time of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo. Yes, thank you.
Which years were those, by the way?
Now you've actually got me. I stepped down in 98, and I had served for 4 years before then. And I served as the deputy to Cyril Ramaphosa. He was the Secretary General and I was his deputy. And when he left the ANC to pursue business interests, I took over up until 1998 as the Secretary General of the ANC.
Okay, no, thank you. Then just lastly, although Ms. Hofmeyer will be asking you the questions, you are telling me your evidence, so
my apologies.
Look at me.
I shall do that, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Carolus, at page 2, paragraph 4, you give us some insight into the role as Minister Hogan had it and as you implemented it at SAA between the shareholder, the board, and management. Can you explain to us how you saw the distinction between those roles and the emphasis that Minister Hogan placed on those different roles?
Thank you, Chairperson. Minister Hogan, when she approached me to serve as a chair, she basically asked me if I'm prepared to sign up to her understanding of corporate governance, and that is the separation of those three areas of responsibility in relation to the airline. And she saw herself very clearly as the shareholder representative who would set a clear set of outcomes and shareholder expectations with us. And she outlined various processes that we would follow to make sure that there was clarity of understanding between herself as the shareholder representative and ourselves as the board, who would then take responsibility for the areas of governance. And that is, we would oversee the development of policy and of strategy and of implementation thereof, as well as the monitoring of the performance of the company and the management in its role in leading the team to achieve the objectives that our shareholder had set for us. She explained to us very clearly that she would hold us accountable, in fact, to those matters. She then convened a workshop of all the chairpersons of all the state-owned entities under her jurisdiction at the time. And one of the important things that stood out in my head was the notion of progressing what used to be semi-government departments or state-owned enterprises into state-owned companies. And I just remembered it was one of those things that stood out, and that she expected us to adhere to the letter and the spirit of all the pieces of legislation and practices that governed the state-owned companies and enterprises in general, such as the PFMA, but also that she expected us to be familiar with and to execute and to legally operate within the framework of the newly adopted Companies Act, which had come into force in 2008.
Thank you. If we then turn to page 4 of your statement in Bundle R, you capture from that page and the following the challenges that SAA was facing when your new board took over. As I have it, you identify 5 different challenges in the course of the next number of pages, and I'd like to take you through each of them. The first that you identify is a governance failure within SAA. Can you explain to the chair what that was when you found SAA?
Thank you, Chairperson. Well, there was quite a bit of violation around just straightforward illegal activities, violations of the PFMA, violation of procurement processes, of tender processes, and there were, in fact, also there was an investigation which our predecessor board had just done, which identified a number of those breakdowns and failures. And that investigation was conducted by KPMG. And when we arrived, we were informed that we were bound legally to, in fact, review and act on those shortcomings. So we had a script of events that was already detailed for us. We reviewed it. The report had just been produced. Our predecessors had not yet had a chance to fully act on it, but they had suspended the previous CEO on whose watch these violations and transgressions had taken place. And so we came then, there was no CEO, and there was an acting CEO at the time who was a member of the executive. And so we then set about acting on that. As a consequence, we were advised to, in fact, lay criminal charges and a number of civil actions to retrieve the monies that we believe were misappropriated or negligently spent at a management level. When we received that advice, all of this was quite new still, and the NPA just was also quite new, and Mr. Menzi Simelane was in fact the head at the time, and because we were not clear how to do this, I personally called him and sought his advice for how we should go about bringing lawful action. And he then advised us that charges should be laid with the with the Commercial Crimes Unit, and there was some, I think even he was quite new to the whole procedure, and there was questions of domicile and so on, but ultimately charges were laid. And I must say, when I was compiling my presentation, it suddenly occurred to me that I don't know what happened to those charges, and they were pretty serious charges, both because of the precedent they set, and in fact the precedent of having to act lawfully on that. Mr. Simelane has since gone, and with him seems to have gone the charges. I don't know what happened to those charges. I said, Chairperson, that there had been major failures in the procurement systems and poor adherence to the PFMA. We had also, very disturbingly, the levels of capitalization of the airline had been very, very poor. Yet the expectations and the opportunities for the airline had grown tremendously. But in a normal company, the shareholder would, when you have a factory and you want to grow the factory, you would need new machines because the market has opened up. Your shareholder would, in fact, be the person who would put up the money so that you can compete better and beat your competitors at the game. But that had not happened at SAN with quite big consequences. It's a big part of how things played out at SAA, and in fact today there's a similar kind of setup. There were also a number of criminal and civil claims against the airline for price fixing and anti-competitive behavior. And some of them were settled only in the last few years. Chairperson, you may recall there was a settlement with Kulula, about a few $100 million actually, where SAA had behaved unlawfully. And that had just somehow not been paid any attention to, and that was one of the things we took on. We also found that the management was quite fragmented and quite disaggregated. So I'll just say there was a very poor staff morale, and with we thought, very bad tone set at the top by some of the ways in which management previously had behaved, which we thought needed to be corrected in terms of setting the tone at the top there. There was a union, there were pilots, there were just between the different levels of the workforce, there just was no team spirit. We also found that SAA in the process had really lost a lot of scale and competitiveness, and that it all had to do with the fleet that we had. There was a whole lot of modern aircraft that had come onto the market that was fuel efficient, much more fuel efficient. The whole offering on board of the airlines had changed, the in-flight entertainment, the leg room, all sorts of things. And SAA had just not held pace with that had not been dealt with. But most importantly, given the location of South Africa, if the airlines flew anywhere outside of 6 hours of a flight, there were two implications. The one was, I think it's 8 hours in the one instance, you were what we called an end of hemisphere carrier. Unlike Emirates or Kenya or Ethiopian Air, who are in the middle of the world, you could be much more nimble-footed if there was any change in the global setup or in your strategy. You could very easily fly up or down this way or that way, whereas we were stuck at the bottom. And there was so much that depended on a well-functioning national airline, and it's a matter which I still have a lot of passion about, and I think there's a lot of disinformation, but I won't bore the House with that. But save it to say that the airline was completely not with a fleet that would enable it to compete globally. It had lost market share and scale, and in fact, we were losing all the opportunities. So we really put forward a very strong request to the shareholder to, in fact, capitalize the airline properly. We had a very weak balance sheet at the time, which just meant that we were in very bad debt. And if we wanted to borrow money in the market, in the financial markets, to grow, it would come at an extortionate rate, because it's a very simple thing. If you were bankrupt, virtually bankrupt, you would have to, you pay much more than if you have a sound one. And if you have a shareholder who indicates a willingness to, in fact, step up to the plate to enable you to grow, to give you the tools and the money to be able to grow and expand, you're much more likely to attract favorable terms for that. We were also thought that our fleet, as it was, were either very small aircraft that could only fly domestically, or otherwise ones that could only fly to Europe, to long haul. Whereas in fact at that stage it was very clear, but apparently hadn't become obvious, but it was very clear the growth for us was into Africa. that, and the idea was to in fact use Johannesburg in particular as a hub that will enable us to do shorter flights into Africa. There was no one who could compete with us on the entire continent in terms of the access we had also into Latin America. And at that stage, we found the emergence of what has become BRICS. And so our whole strategy was to have a fleet that would enable us to fly from the east, bring passengers from China and from India and surrounding countries there through South Africa, and to connect them onward into Africa and into the Americas. And that was a sweet spot that no one could beat us at, not even Ethiopian or Kenya at the time. And so, but we needed a mix of aircraft that would enable us to do that. Another part of our strategy that we identified as a weakness was, in fact, the fact that we needed to develop a very different approach to only seeing ourselves flying as we call it, point to point, and in fact to develop Johannesburg as a hub. The Mumbai route, Chairperson, which is one matter I'll just speak to a little bit very briefly, was particularly important for us in that expansion of what we call the East-West corridor, bringing passengers from Mumbai and Beijing were our two key markets, where South Africa as a country was growing its own trade, and those same people we were trading with were people who were also trading into Africa. And so it was a very important one for us to, in fact, connect major global flows of trade through Johannesburg as a hub. And that was the significance for us at the time of building up the Mumbai route, Chairperson.
You referred to a CEO of SAA who was there before the time of your board. I see in paragraph 8 of your statement, he is referred to as Mr. Kaya Ngulu. I think he was Kaya Ngula.
Oh.
Maybe that should be corrected.
I apologize.
The surname would be spelled as NGQULA.
Yeah. Sorry.
Not Ngulu.
That's a gremlin.
Ngula.
Yeah. My
Okay,
apologies,
thank you.
Mr. Chair, and to Mr. Ngula.
Thank you for that, Chair. Ms. Carolus, if I can then move you to page 6 of Exhibit R. One of the challenges that you've mentioned in your testimony was the fragmented management team and processes that you found in place on your arrival at SAA. And at the bottom of that page 6, you talk about one of your first tasks was the recruitment of a permanent CEO. Tell us about that and who you appointed and why you thought that was one of the key first aspects of your duties as a board.
Thank you, Chairperson. When we arrived at SAA, I had a bit of a joke. I said, it feels a bit like we are at the drama school because everybody was acting in the executive. So many people were in acting positions. And many of the people, with no disrespect, but many of the people in those positions were just not people who were suitably qualified to, in fact, take over permanent positions in there. But it really wasn't for the board to recruit an entire team. We had to start at the top. And the fact that Mr. Ngula was at that point, in fact, had been relieved of his duties, we thought we needed to appoint a leader, a CEO, who would be capable of assembling a team that would be able to meet the challenges, but for us, more importantly, be able to seize the opportunities that we thought offered enormous potential for our country. And we then decided to do the process properly and rigorously because it was important that we got the best person for the job. And we had a huge amount of debate amongst ourselves and sometimes even outside of ourselves because what kind of person were we looking for? And we said we were looking for a world-class person who had international experience and respect and somebody who understood especially the markets where we wanted to grow, like Africa. And we appointed Spencer Stewart, an international headhunting firm, because we thought that it had to be a proper process, that a group who had access to a global pool of skills would be able to give us a set of options. We had some debate and decided we were not going to limit the pool only to South Africa or indeed to Africa, because the script very much had to be, one of the key things was somebody who understood the African aviation market and the airline market, but not exclusively, because Europe was a major trading partner, the Americas was underserviced at the time. And so we went, and we were quite surprised with the caliber of people who applied. There was a deputy CEO of a major Western European airline who applied for the job. There was one CEO of one of our top competitors in Africa who had an exceptional track record who applied. It was a really stellar group of people from all over the world who were on the short list. And at the end of that very rigorous process, the person who emerged was Ms. Sizakele Mzimela, who in fact came out head and shoulders above the rest, actually. And she came out because of her background. She was a banker by training, but had spent most of her professional life, in fact, in South African Airways, initially in a middle management position, and subsequently in a few executive positions, not only at the corporate level, but in fact globally, and had in fact headed up a big piece of work around Africa. She at that stage was the serving CEO of South African Express, which in fact was a major partner, was in fact owned by the South African government as well. And so she understood that alignment and the synergy. So Ms. Mzimela, we really thought was a very good candidate. And we thought it was important that she goes through that process and that she emerges with a confidence, knowing that she was the best in the world for this job that we had to offer.
Thank you. And one of her key tasks you identify at page 7 of Exhibit R at paragraph 18 was to lead the process for the presentation to the board of a strategy to take SAA forward. And over the page, you start to describe in some detail what that strategy was. Could I ask you first of all to describe for the chair what the engagement was with Minister Hogan around that strategy, the extent to which you engaged with her department in its development?
Thank you, ma'am. We understood that it was very important for us to have our shareholder give us the inputs about what the expectations were, and for us to be clear that we would be able to deliver against that. And our shareholder expectations was obviously economic growth, job creation, and transformation. And to be able to do that, we needed to work out what our most competitive offerings would be as the airline. And so we understood that our contribution would not just be to carry people in aeroplanes. It was in fact to contribute to the very hard benefits of trade and tourism, and then in fact our foreign affairs as well. But we understood it to be, how do we make ourselves part of the general transport mix for the effective and efficient transportation of goods and services and people in an economy, in a country that was positioning itself to become globally more competitive and in fact quite aggressively grow in that way. So in terms of our engagement, Ms. Mzimela and her team went through all the processes. There was an aviation unit in the Department of Public Enterprises, and in fact made sure that we all understood and were aligned on how we would contribute to these broader goals of our country. And at the end of that, Ms. Mzimela and her team presented to the board at the strategy session at the end of October 2010, this what was to become known as the new growth strategy, central to which was identifying that we sharpen our areas of focus around where our country was going to compete globally. And our country at that stage, as I was saying, was placing far more emphasis, and we saw the opportunities to align ourselves with what was the BRICS bloc, to trade with India. During my time as the CEO of South African Tourism, we already started to, in fact, grow with huge success. Tourism markets in India, and in fact in China, and so on. We also agreed that given we needed to renew the fleet, to be able to give us the kind of aircraft that we could actually fly into some of our African destinations, which were not 2-hour flights between Joburg and Cape Town, but now 6-7-hour flights. We didn't have aircraft. The ones we used domestically couldn't do that, and the ones we used to London, it was just fuel, completely silly to do that. So in that development, we all arrived at the same page, that SAA, and how we arrived at the fleet, the sense of what fleet we were looking for, and the levels of capitalization that we needed was aligned with trade and tourism and our people interaction as a country. So the board felt comfortable. Minister Hogan and her team joined us in the last 1.5 days, I think, of that session. We presented the whole strategy to her, but as I said, that obviously she would have been consulted. I don't know what the internal processes were, but she was comfortable and her team were comfortable. Her experts, her advisors, a specialist in the department, all signed off on that strategy.
And Ms. Carolus, as I have it from your statement, that occurred in October 2010, is that
Yes,
correct?
That is correct, ma'am. It was literally the end of the month.
Indeed. And then as you conclude on page 8 of your statement, immediately thereafter, on the 1st of November 2010, Minister Hogan was replaced by Minister Gigaba, is that correct?
That is correct, ma'am.
And so you go over the page at page 9 to talk about the steps that you took to ensure continuity after Minister Gigaba took over from Minister Hogan. Can you explain those steps to the Chair?
Chairperson, I, of course, knew Minister Gigaba. He served as the president of the Youth League during my tenure in the leadership as the ANC. And so I just called him and I congratulated him and said to him I would just like to have a courtesy meeting with him to just update him in the work that we had done with his predecessor and to enable him to be familiar enough to engage with us, because it was extremely important for us that there be that understanding. As far as we were concerned, whoever the minister was, was a representative of government, was the shareholder. But if that minister was not aligned with the vision and the strategy that we had evolved, it could create a lot of difficulty. And it had taken us quite a long time to get the alignment through the Minister Hogan and the DPE with trade and industry, with tourism, to make sure that the airline and where it was going would serve those objectives. And so it was important that a successor needs to understand some of that. So, but we didn't want to, so I explained to him that what the process had been, that literally the day before we had concluded and signed off with Minister Hogan, and then the very next day she was replaced by Minister Gigaba. And so I outlined to him that I didn't expect him to sign off on it, but there was urgency, but he was obviously also becoming the minister of the same teams in the DPE, and we assumed that there would be continuity in departmental levels where the ministers came and went. There should be that, because those plans which ministers sign off on obviously are taken in processes, in bilaterals with their colleagues, as well as into cabinet from time to time as is required, like when we want to open a new route to Kwadano in Africa. It would have to go through a set of processes with the Department of Transport. So we assumed that when Minister Gigaba came, that there would be the same teams who would be familiar. So we explained to him that we understood that he Usually ministers bring advisors with them to help them in that transition with the established officials in the relevant departments. And I explained to him that we would get people to take his advisors. He had one person, a professor at UJ at the time, whom he called in, would be one of his policy people afterwards, but it was just an introduction. And we then said, please take the next few months and work through it. But if there is any, I said to him, we had just signed this off in October. In terms of corporate governance, we now had to take it to a board meeting for the SAA board to sign off on it. And that was going to happen in November. And if there was anything at any point as his teams are being briefed that he needed clarification or that he was worried about, he should just phone me and we'll go out of our way to in fact clarify. He had indicated all along that nothing came up from him or his team that worried them. And as a consequence, it was business as usual as far as the shareholder expectations at the high level. We, in all state-owned entities, we have what we call a corporate plan. You have to have a strategy, which then becomes a corporate plan that works on a 4-year cycle, and of course it's a rolling cycle, so every year you extend, you work out what year 4 looks like. And so no concerns were raised by Minister Gigaba or the team under Minister Hogan. And so we, in fact, went into the full budgeting process the following year of 2011 with that same corporate plan, with a vision which we had crafted with Minister Hogan's team, was still in Minister Gigaba's team as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Indeed. One of the things you did in the course of that engagement, as I have it, is presented a strategy to Minister Gigaba on the 18th of April 2011. That appears at the bottom of paragraph 22 on page 9. I'd like you to take you to one aspect of that strategy because you attach it to your statement. Chair, for your benefit, it commences at paginated page 34 of Exhibit R, but the relevant page I'd like to take Ms. Carolus to is at page 62. That is one of the slides which formed part of that strategy briefing to Minister Gigaba.
Did you say 62?
62, indeed.
Okay.
Ms. Carolus, on that page you are summarizing some of the operational challenges, operational changes that you were proposing implementing. I'd like to ask you a few questions about the first item on that page, but just to underscore its relevance. In the latter course of your statement and in your evidence today, you will be testifying about the Mumbai route and the approaches made to SAA from Jet Airways and Minister Gigaba's involvement in those engagements. One of the issues that arises there is the question of the profitability of that route. And it's in that context that I'd like to ask you to speak to paragraph 1 on that page, because one of the things you summarize there as an operational change is that there will be route restructuring in order to operate only profitable international routes. SAA will operate only profitable international routes by the 31st of March 2010, and network profitability must exceed any loss of an individual international route. Now, can we explore that a bit? You mentioned in your testimony the difference between point-to-point as compared with a network route. Can you explain that difference for us?
Thank you, ma'am. Chairperson, I'm glad that, in fact, Advocate Hofmeyer has introduced the airline jargon here, and not myself. But it was a very important fresh way of looking at how SAA must see its own business. A point-to-point route is simply where you fly, let me use an example, London to Cape Town. It was point-to-point, so it was London to Cape Town. Johannesburg represented for us the center of a new approach, and that was of a network approach. So that when you decide how you use how you deploy your limited aircraft that you have at your disposal, because it was quite clear that we would have to shut down some routes and we would have to open up new ones. And the simple criteria was, whether as a network it would be profitable. So when we speak about a network approach, the Mumbai route was quite critical, and it is true we were making losses, and we were building up that route from Mumbai to Johannesburg. Although those losses during our tenure was greatly curtailed, notwithstanding the fact that we were not in an optimal position. We had 4 flights, as we call frequency in the jargon. We would have liked to have had 7 because you make your money out of business people. But where we made that money out of the Mumbai route was in fact pushing those, where many of those travelers were people who sought to travel into Africa or into Brazil to do business in Brazil or in Chile or in Latin America. Now, anyone in this room who has ever flown on the routes to Africa would know that we were charging an arm and a leg. And the simple, hard-nosed business of supply and demand applies. No one had the connectivity that we had. So as a consequence, those same travelers, we started to say we mustn't just look at what people, we mustn't just stop marketing to people Mumbai to Joburg, we must actually start marketing it as a package that you can move on. And so that was why it was so important for us to not just measure it. And sometimes in business people talk about, even about loss leaders, you take a bit of a pain here, but you make that money many times over. So the ticket you sell to somebody is in fact a ticket to Sao Paulo or a ticket to the Congo. So I think that was quite a big change in how we looked at that. Perhaps the other side of that coin, Chairperson, with your permission, was when we shut down the London to Cape Town thing. Both the then Premier and the Mayor, were 2 women I knew quite well, Helen Ziller and Patricia Ziller, were absolutely apoplectic about the fact that we'd done that. And we were making losses on it as well. So similar loss-making route. But the difference there was we were not pushing people on from Cape Town anywhere. And if we have only X number of aeroplanes, and suddenly there were opportunities for us, you'll see somewhere in the paperwork, Chairperson, that in our tenure, in 1 year, we in fact opened 7 new routes into Africa. And it was because of that. Because we could take that aircraft that was flying people, mainly leisure travelers who traveled in economy class, and then that's all you do, you put them down there. Whereas in fact, we could use that same aircraft to fly into other destinations that in fact we would push them on out of South Africa. We would also, we did the same thing with, but maybe let me not get too caught up. Another important aspect of the network process, Chairperson, was it wasn't just about the tickets and the bums on the seats, as we call it. It was also about the more people we bring through Johannesburg and therefore South Africa as a hub. We're growing AXA, but with a landing, because every passenger in that ticket, there's a price that goes towards AXA, our airports company. Everybody who stops here, there's in fact food that Air Chefs provides. There's in fact the South African Airways technical services, which is sadly diminished, and I make a very cursory comment, but it is actually a big problem that it's been so driven into the ground as part of this whole goings on at SAA over the past few years. But so using a hub strategy creates benefits way beyond the ticketing process and the benefits there, because it creates air chefs' jobs, it creates supplier demands of people who provide the food, it provides cleaning services for people who transit here. So when we lose, every flight we lose that lands in Johannesburg, it has a huge knock-on effect of a set of economic benefits for our country.
Thank you, Chair. I note that we have passed the usual time for the tea break. If it would be convenient to take the adjournment now.
Yes, we'll take the tea adjournment now, and we will resume at 25 to 12. We adjourn.
All right.
Yes, Ms. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Carolus, before the break, you were giving us insight into the distinction between a point-to-point route as opposed to from a network perspective. For those of us who are uninitiated in this jargon, would you confirm that it's a fair summary to say that a route could be unprofitable on a point-to-point basis, but nonetheless retained because of its link from a network perspective? Is that a fair summary of your evidence?
That is absolutely fair and correct. Thank you.
Thank you. If we go to page 10 of Exhibit R, you start there at paragraph 24. To describe the unease, as you have it in that paragraph 24, of the developing relationship between the board members and Minister Gigaba. Can you tell us about that strained relationship and how it developed?
Chairperson, we would just find that the minister would, various public fora, for example, at the Cape Town Press Club or in media statements, would, on quite a number of occasions, make utterances which were quite, we thought, inappropriate and unfair and annoying, about where the minister would question the competence of the board and then sometimes even misrepresent some facts. Like the minister at times would say on a few occasions, and quoted in the media, saying SAA has no strategy or no vision. And it's impossible for a state-owned entity to not have a written down strategy, because that has to get signed off every year. It's in fact part of your submissions of your annual report, your financial statements, which you submit in the first instance to the DPE, and then through the DPE as part of its composite report to Cabinet as a whole. So in the first place, it's incorrect to say that SAA didn't have a strategy, because that was signed off on the basis of which our budget is allocated and the basis on which we are audited. Secondly, the minister chose to do this generally in outside fora where we just had no means to defend ourselves, and it would have been quite an awkward position for us to start taking exception to our minister, our shareholder representative. So it was quite an awkward position, but we did feel offended, and we also thought it undermined the airline, where we were trying to build up confidence in the market, ranging from our passengers to the financial institutions from where we would seek money, and where the competence of a board is seen as a key indicator in terms of risk, and therefore it would have an impact on how available money would be for you, or on what terms it would come. And if it's perceived as a board that was incompetent and that was just floundering around the place, of course you can't lend money to an institution like that, because it's not going to, you're never going to see the return on your money that you lend to them. So it really irritated us. And then the other thing was also the minister would often accuse us of being unpatriotic and not caring, and matters that really he had ample opportunity to address through the structures that we had. The question of strategy, for example, there are regular meetings between the department and each state-owned entity with specialist teams where they interrogate, monitor and evaluate the strategy, the corporate plan on a quarterly basis. They're actually formal meetings. And then on all the occasions when we met with the minister, in fact, he spoke quite highly to us about our own capabilities and his confidence. And I think some people really were quite concerned about this very early on. I must say initially I shrugged it off, coming from my own background in politics, that politicians will just always be politicians. They will always be populist in their utterances, and they will always try to blame everybody except themselves for anything under the sun. But we did feel quite aggrieved. And I say initially it was mild irritation, and eventually we felt quite aggrieved because it was starting to question the integrity of the group as in our individual capacities, as well as that of us as a collective.
Thank you, Ms. Carolus. And still at page 10, paragraph 25, you talk about one of the incidents around this negativity in relation to the board. And in so doing, you introduce one of Minister Gigaba's advisors, Mr. Siyabonga Mhlangu. Can you tell us what role he played in relation to the ministry?
Chairperson, Mr. Mhlangu was introduced to us in the course of events by the minister as one of his advisors, and his legal advisor in particular, and he was part of the team. But we got particularly concerned, and why I mentioned Mr. Mhlangu, because Mr. Mhlangu himself started to adopt a more and more prominent role in ways that worried us, because it was not for the board to have a relationship with advisors, or indeed even with any of the minister's staff. Our relationship with the minister was through myself and the minister, and we relate to our teams. And so, but Mr. Mhlangu had just displayed the most extraordinary lack of understanding of those kinds of boundaries in ways that made us quite uncomfortable. He often purported to act with the authority of the minister in some of these matters. And there were a number of little ones, and I'm sure if you ever have an opportunity to interview members of the management of South African Airways during our tenure and afterwards, there were some really disquieting things. But as far as the board was concerned, as he would just pop up, and his behavior and in fact his roles we thought were completely inappropriate and inexplicable. One such occasion that was extraordinary was one of the directors, Mr. Jabulani Ndlovu, was called by an acquaintance.
And Mr. Ndlovu was a board member?
He was a board member,
yeah.
Yes, a chairperson. And he was in fact called by a Mr. George Sabelo, who's a lawyer, to his office, and they were acquaintances, and I'm not sure how they became acquainted. But specifically called to his office, and at this, in their discussion, Mr. Sabelo pointed out to him that was he aware of the fact that the South African Airways South African board was clearly an incompetent crowd of people. They were and he was saying this apparently in a very passionate way, that we were way too big for our boots, that I in particular had the audacity to consider myself to be the minister's political superior, this mistaken impression that I was in fact the minister's political superior, and that in fact the CEO herself was a particularly incompetent person who was only accountable to herself and conducted herself as such. And he then concluded this bit of conversation with Mr. Ndlovu by saying, well, the minister was going to sort the whole lot of us out for this sort of inappropriate big for our boots and lack of accountability to ourselves. Mr. Ndlovu was obviously quite shaken by the fact that some third party could speak so assuredly, and he assured Mr. Ndlovu that these views were communicated by him to him by Mr. Siyabonga Mhlangu, and that Mr. Mhlangu was, in fact, when he was speaking to him, Mr. Sabelo, these were the views of the minister. And Mr. Ndlovu was understandably very disturbed about this, and he called me immediately at the conclusion of this matter. He told me about this exchange, and he said he had said to Mr. Sabelo that he viewed this matter so seriously that he felt he was obliged to inform me as the chairperson of the board of these views that purportedly came right from the minister through his legal advisor to this person whose ties to Mr. Mahlangu, I'm not sure what they were. Upon hearing this, I said to Mr. Ndlovu, I asked him if I viewed it seriously enough to think this should be brought to the minister's attention, and the minister should have a chance to respond to these views which were attributed to him by a third party completely outside of any of both our structures. Mr. Ndlovu said no, of course he was quite prepared, and I said, would he be prepared to repeat this in front of the minister and Mr. Mahlangu? And he confirmed. I called the minister immediately, and the minister granted us an audience the very next evening. And I indicated to the minister beforehand that it was a matter which involved Mr. Mahlangu, and that I thought it would be appropriate to have Mr. Mahlangu in that conversation. So I briefed the minister just on a one-on-one while Mr. Ndlovu and Mr. Mahlangu didn't join us. And because I didn't want the minister, I thought it could be awkward for him if we suddenly start that kind of confrontation. And I informed him, and I said to him that that's why I thought it would be appropriate for him to have an opportunity to hear what people were saying in his name, and for him to say to me now, without Mr. Mahlangu, if these were his views. He assured me they were not, and that I thought Mr. Mahlangu should be confronted for putting out views and speaking in the name of the minister to complete strangers. And he agreed that that was how we should proceed. We then called Mr. Mahlangu and Mr. Ndlovu into the room, and I then explained why we were there, and asked Mr. Ndlovu to repeat what he had told me, and then asked through the minister for Mr. Mahlangu to indicate whether he had any knowledge of these views, and whether these views were views that he had indeed communicated to Mr. Sabelo, and that he had given Mr. Sabelo an indication and some kind of authority that he felt he could and should call members of the board to communicate these views. Mr. Mahlangu, in fact, confirmed in the meeting that he did have this conversation with Mr. Sabelo, but he did say those were his views. He explained that. The minister in that gathering, I asked the minister whether these were his views, and the minister indicates most strenuously that those were not his views, and in fact, he then berated Mr. Mahlangu quite severely right there in our presence. And he went to the extent of saying to Mr. Mahlangu that he considered me as one of his leaders, and that does he know who I am, and he never ever wanted to repeat where Mr. Mahlangu or any member of his staff brought into any question the integrity of myself. And he went further and in fact said he has absolute confidence in our board, in their competence and their integrity, and he then again said to Mr. Mahlangu he does not ever want him to repeat this behavior, where he in fact goes outside to speak on his behalf or communicate negative perceptions about any board or structure that formed part of the ministry or the department. And the minister went further and he said he felt so strongly he was prepared to write a letter to the board to in fact communicate these views. And I said to him, no, I thought that was quite unnecessary. I didn't think that it was appropriate for a minister to write to a board to say this. And we were happy, and we then left it at that.
And did Mr. Mahlangu heed the minister's warning that he should not again repeat the conduct of talking to third parties about matters in relation to SAA and a shareholder?
No, Chairperson. In fact, the very next morning after the minister had communicated in no uncertain terms and quite strongly, in fact, told Mr. Mahlangu that this was inappropriate to talk outside of any of the government structures, and particularly to parties who had no accountability or was not part of anything to do that. And I thought it was quite clear that what the minister meant. Well, Mr. Sabelo phoned Mr. Ndlovu the very next morning and then berated him for having repeated what he told me. So quite clearly, Mr. Mahlangu had phoned Mr. Sabelo and informed him of a confidential meeting between the minister and his board, notwithstanding, and I found it quite astounding, that an employee of the minister actually felt that he could go up against the minister so flagrantly, within hours of having been instructed specifically not to do so.
Ms. Carolus, Mr. Mahlangu, from your statement, plays a further key role in relation to both the Mumbai and Johannesburg route, as well as the overtures that were made to SAA by the New Age newspaper. We'll come to those in due course, but we are now at page 12 of Exhibit R, and at the bottom of that page, you begin to talk about the Mumbai route under Minister Hogan's tenure. Can you tell us about how the issue of the Mumbai route first came to SAA's attention, and deal first specifically about your interactions on it while Minister Hogan was the minister?
Thank you, ma'am. Very shortly into our tenure chairperson as a board, the then acting CEO, Mr. Chris Smythe, came to us with a proposal that we should drop the Mumbai route. We were quite open-minded about all matters at the airline, and but we did indicate to him that you don't just change a route overnight. And we thought that we obviously must review particularly our loss-making routes, but also opportunities. And we thought that that ought to be dealt with as part of a broader strategy and not on a case-by-case basis, a piecemeal basis. And so we heard him out, but we thought it wasn't appropriate for us to look there, and we would agree. We also further thought that you can't make strategy on the hoof, and we needed to evolve a strategy when we ourselves were further down the line. This was within, I think, the first quarter of our being there, I think even in the first month of us being there. And so we said, we also thought that the question of a new strategy had to be developed by a new CEO and team, that we couldn't sit in the boardroom and start evolving this, that we would wait, so we would wait. We didn't think there was the kind of urgency that we had to, because it was no different from any other routes. So this strategy was eventually developed and, as I said, Chairperson, adopted by the board. But so in our conversations with Minister Hogan, this was obviously there's a structure between the DPE has an aviation unit, and then the other ones who look at just the question of expenditure and reports to Treasury on the state-owned companies under their watch, tracks the budget, and so therefore things like loss-making routes was routinely reported on in these quarterly meetings that there was. Excuse me. And so the matter of the Mumbai route never was initiated by us, with Minister Hogan initially. Excuse me, I've just got terrible hay fever, so I get into these sneezing phases where I just start coughing.
Are you fine too?
Yeah, I'm just going to pour myself a little bit more with your permission.
Okay, all right.
So, as I said, so these loss-making routes were discovered routinely at quarterly meetings with the DPE and, in fact, evaluated. We also, in those structures, it's a very clear thing that, one is open to all kinds of options always, and collaborations with other airlines, and where you, at the one hand, you compete, but on the other hand, you can't have destructive competition on any of the routes. The Mumbai route particularly, we could only have what we call in airline jargon 4 frequencies, but it's a simple thing, 4 flights a day, 4 flights that we had a week, which is not optimal, because you particularly want to fill, and anyone in the room who travels business class, Chairperson, would know, the difference between a business class ticket and an economy class ticket is huge. So we anecdotally speak about the front of the bus cross-subsidizes the back of the bus. The back of the bus plays other roles in terms of tourism, who then spend their money in country, and so if they save on the airline ticket, they do that. But, so having 4 flights a week was not optimal, because we wanted business travelers, and indeed tourists too, but everybody to understand, especially premium clients, that every day between Johannesburg and Mumbai there's a flight. And whether you achieve that by collaborating with another airline, but not colluding, but collaborate, because we only had enough aircraft to fly there. And if we could find a way that if I wake up in Mumbai today and my business can't conclude, I know I can stay another day, and tomorrow morning I can get that. My Voyager miles will, whether it doesn't matter what aircraft I sit on and so on. The service is more or less the same. And so if we can both build up that route in the minds of the travelers, that the Johannesburg-Mumbai route is the most reliable one. So we do that, so you compete, but you can't compete destructively, but you also don't collude. And so the process for how you work on that, particularly if you want, as our strategy of building Johannesburg as a hub was one that we needed to further. So we continue with Minister Hogan's tenure, and as I said, nothing comes up in the process. But somewhere along the line, we find that Jet Airways is proposing that SAA should drop the route. It was obviously not it wasn't working for us. And it was a strange request. It wasn't the request of, can we build this route in the minds of travelers as the most reliable route? And then once we've established it and established enough demand, we would be able to then just compete, and then may the best airline win. I think what a lot of people don't realize, and I must say it irritates me now with the discussion, even now with SAA, the airline margins are very tight, and I don't know how any business person would go into airline business. It's between 1% and 3%. I say, as a business person myself, I will never go into a sector where that's your profitability. If one thing goes wrong, as indeed it does, and the biggest thing with us, and we'll come to that later, but if one thing goes wrong, you are making a loss. And so you just can't afford to have silly competition. Whilst you avoid collusion, you actually can't do that. But we find that we have this conversation, and Jet Airways seems to think that we should get off the route, and we decide we're not going to do it. We're happy to discuss collaboration with them, but they're not wanting to do this. They then decide to go on an aggressive strategy against SAA, and they decide to put 7 frequencies on the route as opposed to our 4. But what they didn't have, what we had, was the onward connection. And it relates to scheduling. If somebody's flying onto Sao Paulo from our side, we had to make sure the Mumbai route lands at the time that there was minimal disruption in the connection over to there. So in these efforts of Jet Airways, they try various channels. They call my office, for example, and they say the president of Jet Airways wishes to discuss this. Now, at this stage, this was not even a matter that the board discussed. So my knowledge of it was what came to the board meeting, and as far as we were concerned, this was an ongoing business. It was a work in progress. And so he phoned, and my office just had a very routine response. When anybody phones, they're very open to it, and they just said, what is it in connection with? And is there any documents that we can peruse to decide whether we're appropriate? And they said, no, the Jet Airways president wanted to discuss the Mumbai route with me. And the PA said, came to me, and I said, but I don't discuss routes. The chairperson and the board doesn't. It's a matter which really should be discussed with management, and the request should be channeled through the CEO. Well, subsequent to that, we also heard that, excuse me, and it was a few attempts that the president of Jet Airways made But I didn't think much of it at the time, and I didn't even do it with attitude or anything. It was just inappropriate. It was not a matter that the board should be discussing. It wasn't even a matter that our CEO had raised as an issue for the board to consider at the time. And then at some point, it came to my attention that, and I can't even remember how this happened, but somebody said to me, am I aware of this, and that the president was now going to escalate the matter to the minister, which I thought was quite peculiar, but I wasn't too fussed about it. And I just thought, you don't want the minister to be embarrassed by something. And so I just picked up the phone and I called Minister Hogan and I said to her, look, there is this matter of the Mumbai route and Jet Airways, and I don't know if you're aware of it, but it's an ongoing discussion between our teams on a quarterly basis. And are you aware of this? And she said she's aware of it. There have been some efforts around this. So she, equally like myself, had been aware of it, but didn't think it was appropriate. She thought if it reached the level where it now needed her input, it would come to her through her staff and the appropriate channels. And so she also had dismissed it, and she asked me, is there any truth in it? So I said, no, it's not a matter. It's obviously a matter for discussion as a loss-making route. But I explained to her in very brief terms that what our strategy was we were working, and she was comfortable about it, and comfortable with the fact that if it became an issue of closure or anything other than that, we will come to our shareholder and in fact share with her. And we left it at that.
Ms. Carolus, can I just clarify, when you conveyed to her your strategy in relation to the route at that time,
yes.
Was it a strategy that contemplated closing the route?
No, it was, thank you. We in fact made it very clear to her that no, in fact we were growing the route and that all the indicators were. But firstly, the whole concept was one that she was perfectly at ease with, and we had the numbers which were reported into the system through the department, that we were looking this as a network strategy and not just that. If you look at the ticket that someone buys in Mumbai, it's a ticket that goes to Sao Paulo or that goes to Angola or that goes to the Congo. And so, and clearly we could demonstrate that not only were we minimizing the loss-making part, so we were in fact closing that gap, but we were continuing to in fact build the reputation of Joburg as a reliable hub through which you could go on a reliable, the most awarded airline in Africa, to anywhere in Africa with connectivities that nobody else, no other airline could offer at that stage.
Thank you, Ms. Carolus. At the bottom of page 15 of the Exhibit R, you talk about one of the interactions you had with Minister Hogan. And at the bottom of that page, your statement reads that she called you around August 2010 when she was on a visit to India regarding rumors in India that SAA was about to vacate the route. Now, Ms. Carolus, that is one of the aspects of your statement as I have it, in respect of which you want to make a correction. And the correction is a product of having considered the evidence of Minister Hogan in relation to this interaction with you. Chair, Minister Hogan's bundle was Exhibit L1. I have made copies of the relevant pages of the bundle so that we didn't have to belabor ourselves with the entire set. If I may just beg leave to hand that up.
Yes.
And to give a copy to the witness. Ms. Carolus, this is an extract from Minister Hogan's bundle, which was Exhibit L1, and it is paginated page 21. There you will see at paragraph 93 on that page, Minister Hogan talks about an event in early June 2010, where she was part of an official South African state visit to India. In the light of that, do you have any correction to that last sentence on the page of your statement?
Yes, I'm prepared to correct it. I know, Chairperson, it was somewhere in the middle of the year. It's a long time ago, so somewhere between June and August. So I'm comfortable to accept Minister Hogan's date.
Thank you. And you'll see that on that page 21 from her exhibit, she talks about the interactions that she had with you and the messages that you sent between each of you. Can you confirm that that is correct?
Yes, I can confirm that that is correct.
Thank you.
I think she kept the phone and I didn't.
Indeed. And then if we go over the page at page 16 of your statement, that is Exhibit R. You'll see there you now move to a discussion of the Mumbai route under Minister Gigaba's tenure. And you talk about an interaction at the end of 2010, that is shortly after Minister Gigaba has replaced Minister Hogan. If you could please take the chair through that interaction.
Thank you, ma'am. Chairperson, Minister Gigaba was appointed on the 1st of November to his position as minister, and in December, so within weeks of his appointment, other than our general exchanges where I had initiated to get the continuity, one thing that he asks us for a meeting for specifically is a meeting to discuss the Mumbai route. So within weeks of arrival, he makes this a priority. He calls for a meeting with myself and the CEO to discuss this route. Unfortunately, it was very short notice. Unfortunately, I was not able to extricate myself out of my difficulties, which I explained to the minister. And then in my stead, I sent the chairperson of the audit committee, the late Zakele Sitole, to in fact accompany Ms. Mzimela. Ms. Mzimela sent a document ahead to in fact explain. We knew it was going to be the Mumbai route. She sent that ahead to the minister, and I think she may even have spent some time with the minister before to ask him if he had any questions that he wanted to clarify, to just explain what our approach to the route was and our sort of vision around why we think it's important for us to stay on the route. They did that. So subsequent to them having been to the meeting, they then came and gave me a report back, seeing as they were there representing myself. They gave me a report of what transpired at the meeting. The one thing which struck me, and I think them at the time, that was quite extraordinary, the Minister Gigaba tells them that he is expecting some more people. Not an unusual thing. They wait. Minister Gigaba is there, his deputy is there, and then Mr. Mahlangu is also in the meeting. And they then proceed to sit and wait for these unidentified people. The minister doesn't share who they are, and they wait for 3 hours. In the minister's office, they're waiting. The minister's not sure when they're arriving.
And all along, they don't know who the people are that they are waiting for.
They don't know who they're waiting for. But it was
obviously the minister knew.
Yeah, the minister knew. But it was quite extraordinary that a whole minister would sit for 3 hours and just wait. No, we don't know when they're coming. We are just waiting. We're expecting them. So when they arrived, there were 2 gentlemen, apparently, one of whom was the president of Jet Airways, and another person from Jet Airways. And then the minister apparently just took a back seat, and the entire discussion was led by the president of Jet Airways, who was quite discourteous to Ms. Mzimela and started to interrogate her about why South African Airways was not getting off the route, and that they should be getting off the route. And this carried on for a while, and Minister Gigaba did nothing, said nothing, and eventually Deputy Minister Ben Martins, he was then the Deputy Minister, he in fact berated this gentleman and said to him that he had no business coming into our country telling us what to do with our airline. And in fact, clearly, not only that, he was speaking from a complete position of ignorance and a sense that we were accountable to him for what our strategies were.
So it was the Deputy Minister who actually
Rose to the
intervened,
defense. Yes,
but
we
the
jumped in.
Minister Gigaba did not intervene.
No, he did absolutely nothing. And in fact, he just let this exchange, and in fact, he allowed the gentleman from Jet Air to lead the discussion and set the tone and interrogate.
And yet the understanding was that this was a meeting wanted by the minister.
Yes, yes, sir. Our shareholder. We, SAA, it was awkward for Mr. Sitole and for Ms. Mzimela, but they just felt that they should once again recommit to say, we are open to, our presence on the route is not optimal, we would say that. And there were two parties who were both trying to build the route. So SAA would consider all reasonable proposals that made business sense to us and that in fact followed our due processes. So whatever proposals they have, they should do that. And the minister urged us all, them all, to find one another that they should do this. So I don't know if you want to go on to the Airways,
Thank you.
The Airways Park.
Well, maybe let me ask you a question. SAA was running this Johannesburg-Mumbai route for itself. Now you have people outside of government, actually from another country, coming and effectively saying, you people must terminate this route. You must stop being involved in this route, in effect. Is that right?
No, that is indeed correct, sir.
Isn't that very strange?
We certainly thought it was most peculiar. I mean, it just didn't make sense. Here was our shareholder, just allowing, and that's what Deputy Minister Ben Martins apparently pointed out to them, was that. Yes.
I mean, this was not, and you must just tell me if I missed something, this was not like a case where you, SAA, might be having some project that needs to be done and might be looking for people who might offer those services, and then somebody comes and says, you must give the job to me. This was simply a situation where SAA was running this route, and then somebody says, you must stop because they want to be involved.
That is correct, sir. And in fact, more than that about this, there was some history where SAA had been having some collaborations with them, and which preceded us. So I won't speak about it. But not only were people asking us to get out of what our business was, and that is to run an airline and to open routes. But I remember that, and you can maybe clarify this more if you see some other members of management, but Jet Airways had done business with SAA and quite frankly just refused to pay at some point as well. So there was a bit of that as well. But for us it was very clear that if Jet Airlines came up with a proposal that would help, that would serve both of our interests, we would be quite happy to discuss this and consider it. It just had to go to the process. It had to go into the structures of the airline in the first instance, and then into the DPE, should the need arise, to evaluate whether what they gave us made business sense. We were actually a company. And so, but Chairperson, if you're puzzled, I can assure you I am as puzzled to this day. It was most extraordinary that people could ask you to not, to close.
It's like you don't know what you are doing.
Yes.
So
yes.
we have to tell you that
yes.
This is you shouldn't be doing this. So stop it.
Yes, and that's what Deputy Minister Ben Martins apparently effectively had to do. That this man was just carrying on and really speaking in the most disrespectful and discordial manner to Ms. Mzimela.
Ms. Hofmeyer.
Chair, just before we continue, and Ms. Carolus, I'll take you next to paragraph 46 of your statement at page 17. We'd just like to clarify for your benefit, Chair, there is every intention to call the members of the management team of SAA at the time in due course in the evidence. So while Ms. Carolus is giving the version of the story from her perspective, because it was reported to her, there will be further evidence which will speak to these issues by the relevant individuals.
No, thank you for saying that, because I was going to ask you in due course to confirm that people who were at the meeting will come and
Indeed.
and confirm what she says.
Importantly, on that aspect, Chair, the analysis of the profitability of the route, of whether SAA should get off the route or not, whether the Jet Airways demand that they relinquish it should be entertained, was the subject of a detailed analysis by the management team, and that will in due course be presented to the Commission. So at this level, Ms. Carolus is dealing with it from the board perspective, but the detail, the profitability, the analysis, the failures of Jet Airways to pay in previous interactions with SAA will be traversed.
Come from management.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Ms. Carolus, at paragraph 46, you talk about another strange event that occurred on that day of the meeting with Minister Gigaba, where the representatives of SAA were required to wait for 3 hours. Can you please take the chair through that odd interaction that occurred?
Thank you, ma'am. Chairperson, whilst upon a return to the office, Ms. Mzimela's office informed her of another thing that was quite odd, that still puzzles to this day. Whilst Ms. Mzimela and Mr. Sitole were in the minister's office, a gentleman called Ms. Mzimela's office saying that there was an agreement which Ms. Mzimela had to sign. And the gentleman informed Ms. Mzimela's PA that it was an agreement with Jet Airways. And Ms. Mzimela's PA informed him that Ms. Mzimela was not in, and he apparently behaved in quite an aggressive way and said, well, this was quite urgent, and he was quite irritated that Ms. Mzimela was not available to sign, and Ms. Mzimela's PA...
I'm sorry, I missed out. Who was being aggressive?
The caller, who purported to be from Jet Airways, and said he had an agreement from Jet Airways that Ms. Mzimela was required to sign. And then was quite irritated that Ms. Mzimela's PA was insisting that she's not there. And she eventually, because it was an agreement that this gentleman was referring to, she then put him through to the company legal counsel, Advocate Sandra Kutsia. He explained himself to Advocate Kutsia, and Advocate Kutsia said she had no knowledge of such an agreement, because she would know when, by the time it reaches the level where the CEO has to sign off. She assured him she would have known, and so therefore she didn't think this was possible. The gentleman was quite insistent and aggressive, and eventually Advocate Kutsia urged him to send her the documents, that if there was something that she had missed, but she was quite clear that if it reached the level where the CEO now had to sign, she would know about it. So apparently there was some email correspondence between herself and them, but I don't know the detail of that. And, but nothing came, and eventually no agreement was signed between Jet Airways and South African Airways.
And just to be clear on the timing, this approach happened at the time that the meeting that had been called by Minister Gigaba was underway. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Did you get to know why the two gentlemen who kept everybody waiting for 3 hours at that meeting, when they came to that meeting, did you ever get to know what was so special about them that the minister and the deputy minister, and of course, everybody had to wait for them for so long. You might not know, but I just want to know, in case you got to know at any stage, what was special about these people?
No, I did not know, Chairperson. As I said, it was just peculiar that a whole minister will sit for 3 hours. And it seemed to be an indefinite wait. No one knew, including the minister, when these gentlemen were going to pitch up. It turned out that, as you say, one person was the president of Jet Airways. And so it was clearly a special treatment for, I don't know, for the individuals or for Jet Airways. But no, we didn't know.
And from the report that you were given, the minister hardly made any contribution to the discussion.
No, he made no contribution to the discussion. He just allowed the president of Jet Airways to effectively lead the meeting and the charge. And he just sat. And the only person who eventually stepped in when it was apparently really getting quite undignified and really impugning the dignity of Ms. Mzimela was Deputy Minister Ben Martins, who rose to a defense and asked the gentleman to desist from this Mr. Naresh Goya, who's the president of Jet Airways.
And Ms. Gross, just to clarify in time again, this is a matter of weeks after Minister Gigaba takes over the ministry from Minister Hogan. Is that correct?
That is correct, ma'am.
Thank you. I'd then like to go to page 18 of your statement, Exhibit R, because you there talk about a second interaction that occurs over the Mumbai route. It is a meeting that was called in April 2011. Can you take us through that interaction?
Yes, Chairperson. Sometime in 2011, I again received a request that Minister Gigaba wishes to meet with us in Cape Town. Now this, I think anybody who's worked with state-owned entities or government at large would know one often gets a request at very short notice to present oneself, and because of the respect for the office and the institution, you go. On this occasion again, I was unfortunately unable to change my prior commitments, and I communicated this to the minister, but I instead sent Mr. Teddy Daka, another board member, to accompany Ms. Mzimela to the meeting. At that stage, we were in quite advanced discussions with the minister, because remember, I did indicate, Chairperson, that we started to discuss, to in fact immerse the minister in where we had arrived, and ultimately the question of the recapitalization so that we could acquire a new fleet and a whole number of things. So we assumed it was that. And so Ms. Mzimela and Mr. Daka went off, and they reported that, when they came back, they reported back to me that upon arrival, the minister indicated that he had a few matters that he wished to discuss with them, one of which was the Mumbai route. And so everybody sort of accepted that, and then the minister stopped his intervention.
So this was now the second time he wanted to discuss the Mumbai route?
Yes, yes, sir. But as I say, and then the minister opens the meeting, he declares he has a few matters he wishes to discuss, and it seems almost just peripheral, you know. Let's just start with the first matter I want to discuss with you, is the Mumbai route. And the minister then keeps quiet, and then Mr. Siyabonga Mahlangu starts to interrogate.
That's his legal advisor.
This is the minister's legal advisor, the same one who called another board member, whose friend called another board member to indicate the minister's displeasure and the board's arrogance and so on. So Minister Gigaba makes no further contribution, but Mr. Mahlangu now proceeded to berate Ms. Mzimela for SAA's refusal to close the Mumbai route. And amongst other things, he says to her that, we are wasting government money. You could have been building lots of RDP houses with this. Remarks which are quite inappropriate for a legal advisor.
And this is now in front of
Minister
Gigaba.
The minister is saying nothing. Mr. Mahlangu is now leading the conversation around the Mumbai route, and in fact, taking Ms. Mzimela to task for this. And as I say, amongst other things, saying this money could have been used for RDP housing. Entirely inappropriate conversations. We've got a meeting every quarter where we discuss and we motivate why, what we're doing, and where the changes are necessary and so on. At this point, Ms. Mzimela apparently asserted firmly, I'm told by Mr. Daka, that she took exception to being addressed in that manner. Mr. Daka also then, in fact, appealed to the minister to please contain Mr. Mahlangu and to ask Mr. Mahlangu to behave himself in an appropriate manner. And in fact, in other words, this behavior by Mr. Mahlangu, notwithstanding the previous 2 occasions, one where in the presence of the minister indicated to him his behavior was inappropriate. The next morning he's phoning, his friends are now phoning, so he's speaking to his friends, notwithstanding the fact that the minister had warned him and asked him. Now he stands in front of the minister and he starts behaving in an inappropriate. And at that point...
and then what was the minister's response, Minister Gigaba's response to the suggestion that he should rein in Mr. Mahlangu or contain him?
I don't know what the detail was, but the minister then, at that point, I don't know whether he said anything, but at that point he then said he's got some people he wants to invite to join the meeting. Now...
Said he what?
He wants to invite some people to join the discussion.
Oh, okay.
The minister now says. So at that stage, the minister then invites, so 2 gentlemen joins the meeting, one of whom is, again, the president of Jet Airways at the minister. The SAA team at this stage had not been informed at all by the minister or anybody that, in fact, these were Jet Airways. They didn't know anybody else was joining the meeting in the first instance, and secondly, that these were Jet Airways people. So the minister just brings them into the meeting at that point. And then the minister says, he concludes and he says, so there was no further discussion, either with the Jet Airways people or whatever, because by now both Mr. Daka and Ms. Mzimela had asserted the fact that we're not getting off the route, we're on track as discussed. And then the minister concludes and says, can South African Airways and Jet Airways please find one another? Now, as far as Ms. Mzimela and Mr. Daka were concerned, it was not satisfactory. That as far as we were concerned, we had discussed this matter with the minister on his own, with the Jet Airways people in December. We had done a presentation to the minister on the matter. We were in discussion with the department and their officials, and in fact why we were on the route and what the strategy was around it. And the minister now asking us to find one another, but they nevertheless committed and said, look, if we are really open to any proposals that makes business sense to us, that fits in with our strategy, and if it goes through due process. And that's
basically what they had said in December as well.
Yes, that's basically what they said in December. And we were discussing the route in the quarterly meetings, along with all the other routes, loss-making or profitable, with the minister's officials every quarter. So the minister then says, okay, we'll conclude this conversation. Can you people please find one another? Now, Minister Gigaba then did not raise, despite him having opened the meeting to say, I have a few matters to discuss with you, he then has nothing further to discuss with the team. And it was quite clear that Minister Gigaba had requested myself and the CEO to fly to Cape Town in order to discuss the Mumbai route at the behest of Jet Airways once again. And Chairperson,
But also, not only that, but in circumstances where nothing new would transpire, compared to what you had discussed at the meeting in December. Am I right?
No, absolutely, Chairperson. And without any indication to us that, no indication whatsoever about it as well. In fact, we found it quite peculiar and puzzling at the time. And I can really say this, that it was just peculiar that the minister is our shareholder. If you own a business, he was our shareholder, and he seemed to be quite persistent in to assist Jet Airways and SAA to find one another. When you're competing with a competitor, you're competing. And as a shareholder, you're actually not about to help the other side.
Yeah.
And it's clear that the minister is in conversation with Jet Airways in a way that is not with us. It's clear he wants us to find and support Jet Airways, but he's never asking us how he can help us on the route. And in fact, there were a number of issues around the route, which I'm sure the management team can maybe recount more fully. But, in moving people on and through into Africa, I recall vaguely there was real hassles that the minister could have helped us on, like assisting us with visas, because they suddenly started to introduce a barrier that people who were traveling from Mumbai would need a transit visa to get to Africa. And we thought this was silly, because there was no security risk with somebody who was contained in our airport. But you make them pay. So you're introducing a fresh barrier, in fact, to advance our strategy of the network into Africa. So specifically for people traveling to Africa. So that's why, as I said, we found it most peculiar that the minister were, with no briefing of us, like calling me, the chairperson and the CEO, to yet another meeting without telling us that is this, but even the very thought that he would be so persistent to help them out when he never showed the same, he never called us to say, right, SAA, tell me what can I do to help you on the Mumbai route. But he was clearly talking to Jet Airways how he can help them to find us on the Mumbai route.
And at that meeting, the Jet Airways representatives didn't say much at the second meeting.
No, they didn't, because Chairperson, I think at that stage, the minister, it was quite clear to the minister that the SAA team were not, didn't have any mandate to discuss anything outside of our discussions with the department, and they indicated their discomfort to in fact discuss, revive the discussion that we had in December. And so I think you'll have to ask for more detail from the team when they get here. But yeah, no, so there wasn't further discussion. But Mr. Mahlangu was quite clearly interrogating, took it upon himself to do the speaking on behalf of whatever.
Well, what I find strange is that in the first meeting, the Jet Airways representatives, apart from arriving 3 hours late, came and basically led the discussion instead of the minister leading the discussion. And then in the second meeting, you are not told, that is, SAA is not told that Jet Airways would be there, and they are not there when the meeting starts, but they are brought in when it is about to end, and basically don't make any contribution. So I'm wondering whether the problem was simply that this time the meeting started without them, whereas the first time the meeting had to wait for them, and that maybe this second time they were just arriving, and the minister was not prepared to continue and just close the meeting, or whether they had been waiting in some other room all along, and why they were brought in if they were no longer going to make any contribution to the meeting before it closed.
Chairperson, I think you would need to ask the people, the two parties
The
were there.
people were there,
But
yeah.
what Mr. Daka, I didn't want this to sound like a chatty thing. I took this very seriously, what I put in my statement. But Mr. Daka ended up having to fly with his child to Cape Town. And the child was being looked after by some members of staff in the reception area. And at some point he stopped off with the child he was going to the bathroom, so he just checked that his daughter was okay. And he of course didn't know the president of Jet Airways because he was not in the previous meeting. And he saw this gentleman was there. And he was playing with his daughter outside. And so they were clearly there. They clearly were now waiting to be called into the meeting. Why they didn't have a discussion, but it wasn't because they hadn't arrived, and that's why the minister clearly knew they were outside. But I think the conversation went a bit different to what it may have been intended, with Mr. Daka and Ms. Mzimela in fact asserting the fact that we have nothing new to contribute, and then Mr. Mahlangu was in fact setting the tone and leading the conversation in this instance and his approach to the meeting was quite clearly to communicate to Ms. Mzimela, and for his benefit Mr. Daka's too, and it would have been me, I don't know if he would have done the same, to effectively say his follow-up was, now why have you not gotten off this route? So and I think Ms. Mzimela and Mr. Daka are quite clearly asserted, that we were not, there was nothing that had changed. So I don't know, you might have to ask them whether they knew. I also can't say, Mr. Chair.
But as you understand it from the December, was it the December? From the first meeting.
Yes,
December. From the first meeting, if the basis on which the meeting ended contemplated that if Jet Airways wanted SAA to do anything, maybe to stop this route, they would have needed to put in some proposal or something that would make business sense to SAA, and they had never done that between the two meetings.
That is correct, sir. In fact, it wouldn't have gone the appropriate way at which it happens, like in any business. That one business approaches the other business. It shouldn't have gone to the department,
shareholder.
Because the department is not the trading partner. The department, like the board, would get involved much further down the road if it was necessary, depending on the nature of that agreement.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Carolus, you give us some perspective on the unusual nature of this interaction with Minister Gigaba in April of 2011, because you draw a contrast in paragraph 51 of your statement with the approach that had been taken in relation to a requested route that SAA had sought to cease and close. Can you tell us about that? It relates to Botswana.
Yes, Chairperson. We were losing quite a lot of money on the route to Botswana. And in fact, when we think about it, we can think again, even people like ourselves, if I go to Botswana, let me speak for myself, I drive. It's just not a route that makes sense that people would do, and I mean, even business people. So we were making even bigger losses on that route. So we wanted to close the route down. And not least of all because that aircraft could be used much more profitably on a different route. And we were now reconfiguring what routes we were on. But we have to get the permission of the shareholder in terms of the PFMA to actually, it's not the shareholder, it's a process that has to go through. But ultimately government, we have to get government permission to open or close a route in terms of particularly significant financial transaction and events. And so we needed government's permission to close that down. And they really dragged their feet on it. And in fact, we sustained quite heavy losses, and there was no reason given ever. It wasn't because they thought, there was no questioning of it. There was just a total lack of focus and a sense of urgency. And as a consequence, we were just bleeding. And so we really felt it was so irrational. And we were quite miffed about that, because we said, why are they carrying on about this Mumbai route? And they're not doing anything on the thing. And then not least of all, it's the only route that the minister ever called us specifically to have a discussion about was the Mumbai route.
Chair, just to complete this aspect, you'll find at page 159 of Exhibit R just an excerpt from the PFMA. It's section 54, and the relevant section there is sub 2, which in essence requires public entities who are going to enter into a series of transactions to...
I'm sorry, Ms. Hoffman, what page?
159.
Of R?
Of R, yes.
I have up to 152.
Oh,
You should have the updated version. If I may just beg leave to hand a copy to you. I do have an extra one.
Well, I think what you should do is, if you have given me a bundle earlier, I work on that one.
Indeed.
And then when it's updated, that one should be updated rather than giving me a new one.
Indeed.
So, okay, let me have those pages.
Here are the pages. As I understand it, there were efforts made to update yesterday, but it may be that there was some error in that regard.
I think there may be a file that's updated, but
it's not your
I haven't
original
been working
one.
on that one.
Indeed.
So I work on the first one you give me. So the best thing is to update that one rather than give me a new one.
Indeed, Chair.
Okay.
We'll ensure that happens in future.
Okay, all right, thanks.
If we go to page 159, you'll see that that is a copy of section 54 of the PFMA. It's just to locate the evidence of Ms. Carolus in the relevant legislative context. As I understand Ms. Carolus's evidence, there was a need in respect of closures of routes to obtain approval from the executive authority, and in this case that would be the Department of Public Enterprises, and that is because the closure of a route qualifies as a 54 sub 2E event. It's a transaction which involves the commencement or cessation of a significant business activity. Is that correct, Ms. Carolus?
that is correct, ma'am.
So it's in that context that you were seeking, as I have it, approval for the closure of the Botswana route. You weren't receiving it, however, and at the same time you were being pressured to close the Mumbai route. Is that a fair summary?
That's a fair summary, Chairperson.
If we then go to the bottom of page 19 to conclude this aspect, you conclude at paragraph 54 on the basis that SAA did not receive any proper proposals regarding the closure of the Mumbai route. And you go over the page to talk about what happened after your term at the board of SAA. If you can just take us through that. What then happened to this Mumbai route?
Thank you, Chairperson. Jet Airways then we had 4 frequencies, so they put 7 on. And as a consequence, both airlines, SAA and Jet Airways, suffered even bigger losses because it became quite negative competition. But SAA, however, managed to survive on that route because of our hub strategy, of the fact that we made money by connecting people onward in a way that Jet Airlines couldn't compete with us on it. So eventually, Jet Airways abandoned the route. They couldn't continue the route. Well, thereafter, Chairperson, Etihad Airways bought a stake in Jet Airways. SAA also gave up the route, and I can't remember what preceded what. I have no indication of why SAA gave up the route, because as far as I was concerned, that in fact the route kept on growing. We kept on closing the losses, and in fact there's another technical word that's used in airline speak, and it's called load factors. And that's basically just what proportion of the plane is full. And we got, I think, up to about 80% of the, full of seats, bums on seats. It doesn't necessarily translate straight into profits, and I'm sure if Ms. Mzimela comes, she can speak better to this. But I think, again, you don't need to be too much of a rocket scientist or a business person even. But when you're building a route with 4 frequencies, your pricing is sensitive to that, but your pricing at the back of your head is also, your money is made in that connection thing. So we were still making losses, but our load factors were increasing. And I think in business terms, once you've built that client base, you can then incrementally increase, with a longer term vision to it. But it's sort of, from a network perspective, we were still doing well. So I've got no idea why eventually SAA gives us the route up. SAA does not conclude anything with Jet Airways. Jet Airways then gets into a thing with Etihad. And then Etihad Airways now hubs everything through their hub of Doha into Africa. So they're getting that whole benefit of the onward distribution, of the network distribution. SAA now co-chairs with Etihad. And so, in fact, all the business that SAA has and is built up now goes through Doha and Etihad. Access lost that business of coming through Joburg. The air chefs business, the cleaning staff business, the suppliers of food, everything that used to come. In addition, we now no longer have a direct flight. So South African business travelers and tourists on both sides, what used to be a 6-hour route is now a 9.5-hour flight. And so why would anyone even want to catch that SAA flight to Etihad? And you just, if you can, just go directly to Doha rather than come through Johannesburg. And we've also lost that onward connection into the Americas that we offered the most seamless route. So it's Africa and, in fact, that west corridor that we were painstakingly building up.
Thank you, Ms. Carolus. I'd now like to move to a second topic, which is the new age and the approaches that were made to SAA in that regard. That commences at page 20 of your statement.
Yes, Chairperson.
You begin at paragraph 55 to talk about the approach that was made to SAA from New Age newspaper and the attitude of the bid adjudication committee to that initial approach. Can you please tell the chair what that was?
Thank you, Chairperson. I must say, Chairperson, that I never got involved in all the nitty-gritty, so I can't give you the exact detailed process, but all I can say, one of the things which Ms. Mzimela established as part of a mandate to restore the governance was, in fact, the bid adjudication. So just better transparency, more rigor, and steps to be followed that was more compliant with the PFMA. So it was not anything extraordinary. It was just making sure that those processes were there, fairness, transparency, and lawfulness. And so this structure called the Bid Adjudication Committee, every time there was tenders and stuff that were below a certain quantum, even the CEO didn't see these. They just went through, according to the delegation of authority, they would then go there and be adjudicated. All I know, there was a process, and ultimately the outcome of this was that it did not meet the business criteria of SAA, and so it was turned down. The CEO, the board, were not cited to this because there was a clear process that had to be followed. Somewhere along the line, I didn't even know about this. This I got to know with hindsight, because matters like newspapers don't come to the board. And as I say, they rarely come to the CEO because it's an established process and delegations of authority. And then I got a call from the then Director General somewhere out. So my first knowledge of this is I get a call from Mr. Tsediso Matona to say to me that he requested an urgent meeting to discuss this matter. So I had no knowledge, and I said to him, no, I have no knowledge, and I have no interest and no authority. This was a management matter if it concerned a newspaper. And I said to him, was there a complaint? And because I thought sometimes if, a newspaper is treated badly, it's useful for the chair to know, and then just to give the reassurance that, look, I'll raise this matter with management and make sure they address it, which was what I thought how we would deal with this. And he then said, no, it was actually a matter that management had not handled satisfactorily, and could I come and meet with him? So I thought I, A, know nothing, and B, have no business discussing newspapers. So I called the CEO and I said to her, do you know anything about... I eventually agreed to meet with Mr. Matona because he was clearly quite agitated and felt it necessitated my having to do this. I then called Ms. Mzimela and I said to her, do you know anything about this matter? She then briefed me about her own knowledge of it, which was not fulsome. I think that's for the simple matter that she doesn't deal with newspaper matters either. And there were processes which were dealing with it.
And the Director General at the time was
Mr. Tsediso
Matona.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, sir. So she gave me a briefing because I said to her, can you please bring me up to speed to this, because I don't want to walk into a meeting to discuss newspapers that I knew nothing about. And so we get to the meeting, and there is Mr. Mahlangu in the meeting with Mr. Matona. Now, I mean, it was also very strange because we were not discussing a legal matter, and even if we were, the minister's advisor would not be present, and the chair of the board certainly wouldn't be present. It would be our legal counsel from SAA, if it was even necessary for somebody at her senior level. Normally, lawyers and lawyers in the DPE and the SAA would meet. So what the minister's legal advisor was doing in that meeting was odd. It was the first thing that struck me was it was most peculiar for him to be there from all angles. So when Mr. Matona explained why, I said, why am I here? Why is Mr. Mzimela here? And I was quite irritated because I actually had to leave something else that I was doing, but I thought if the Director General of the department calls me, it must be at a sufficiently senior level, and if he calls me to say the response from the CEO was unsatisfactory, because normally the board chair would relate to the minister and the Director General would relate to the CEO. And he now clearly felt the matter was of such an order that he had to escalate it to me because he was not getting satisfaction, and so I honored that. And I was quite intrigued and annoyed that I was called out of something else to be told that there was whatever. Anyway, so when Mr. Matona, I said, I still don't understand why am I in this meeting, or for that matter, why the CEO is in this.
I'm sorry, I may have missed something.
No, sorry.
You are now at the meeting.
I am now at the meeting.
And somebody has raised
Matona
the issue of why this meeting was called.
No, I'm saying, thank you, can you explain to me why am I here? And Mr.
Yes.
Matona says it's to discuss the matter of this new age newspaper. So I said, I still do not understand.
Yes, okay. Okay.
I know nothing about newspapers. It's outside of my competence, or indeed outside of my area of response. It's inappropriate
Yes.
for me. In fact, I also think it's inappropriate for the CEO even to be here, because this is not the matter that is hers. She's going over somebody else's head to do this. And then I think the DG explains that, well, the new age is a new entrant in the media scene, and he thought that in accordance, that to encourage media diversity, that they should be supported. The new age should receive some support. I assured the meeting that certainly from my perspective, I'm sure it's a laudable thing, and I'm sure that from our developmental mandate, which is part of our mandate as SAA.
Well, I just want to say you may or may not have listened to Mr. Manyi's evidence a few days ago, but he told us that he spoke to his fellow DGs from other government departments in whatever forum they had, that there was the new age, and that was new in the market, and he said to them it should be supported. So I'm hearing something similar.
And I assured the meeting that, Chairperson, that obviously it had been a matter of concern in South Africa that, media ownership was so concentrated. And so it's a laudable thing in any democracy, even in mature democracies, that, diversity in media is a healthy thing. What I did question was that whose job that was. So in principle, I'm sure that both the board and the company would at the high level say, of course, my media diversification is a good thing. The question was whose mandate? Because what we were being asked had a financial implication. It was around matters. And again, Chairperson, I wish to just put a disclaimer up front. The detail of it I was not interested in. But it's safe to say that SAA spends money as far as newspapers are concerned. It's in fact to create visibility for the airline. So we sometimes run campaigns, or the airlines, like any company. You publicize, and especially when it comes to buying space, to place an advert, it is to meet a particular economic objective. So in the case of SAA, it's in fact to increase your profitability, so your passengers in it. I know from my days at South African Tourism, we would line up all the stakeholders, airlines, hotels, and everyone, to promote low demand periods like winter. And that's where things like the Short Left campaign came in, where we encourage South Africans at a hugely discounted rates to do that. We would never run a campaign in December when everybody was fighting to get a seat on an aeroplane, or even at seasonal points like the opening of Parliament. When there's a high demand, you would not run a campaign during that time. Similarly, we would pay for advertising space for advertisements. I think this is in the public and the private sector when you say these jobs. All those works, whether they were campaigns or whether they were adverts, were very specific to reach your target market. For example, if you were advertising seats to an expensive destination, you would not place those adverts in a newspaper that was specifically their target audience was a segment that was not that group of people. Whereas if you ran the Short Left campaign, it's highly unlikely you would do most of your spend in the Financial Times. And so you had to target very specific segments when you place advertising, and talking paid advertising, not coverage. And then you would also spend your money where there was a proven track record that that newspaper had the circulation in the segment that you were relating. So you weren't just spending money with newspapers willy-nilly. There was actually, you had to have a proven track record. The New Age at that stage was new, and whilst one had sympathy for the developmental mandate of media diversity, for a democracy to have a healthy spread of opinions, there were state institutions whose job it was to help new entrants in all sectors. For example, the IDC, the PIC, so that if you wanted to build a new company against big competitors who were well established, that's where the development finance institutions came in. That it was inappropriate, and we considered in fact a violation of our mandate as a company to see our role to effectively do CSI distribution of largesse. And this was particularly also applicable for us with an activity, and I'm not even sure how much, I don't even think it merited a intense discussion in SAA. We were invited, and even people like myself, as chairpersons were invited, to pay for seats at breakfasts. SAA never participated in the breakfast of the New Age because we thought it was a violation of what we were authorized to spend our money on, that we couldn't spend millions on breakfasts of that kind. So, Chairperson, that's just where some of our media, and so as a consequence, if you'll just indulge me, Chairperson, we then did offer, it went through the whole processes in SAA to my knowledge, and we then offered the new age during our term, the same terms with a little bit of leeway perhaps to encourage them, but on the whole we also felt from a fairness perspective, we couldn't just offer them prices or opportunities that was not available to every South African company. That we could be taken to court for that matter if we give company X for no discernible reason that we could explain in terms of our mandate. We gave opportunities or a pricing structure for whether it's advertising or any business that we conduct with them that was out of kilter with the normal, transparent opportunities available to every company in South Africa and the number of newspapers in South Africa.
So the new age, as you understood the position from the CEO when she briefed you, had approached the relevant people at SAA in order to get some business, but the answer had been no. And then there was a request for this meeting. Is that right?
Chairperson, the answer was that some aspects were turned down and some opportunities were offered.
Before this meeting was requested? Meeting. Okay.
So I surmise that clearly the ones that were accepted was not good enough, that the material ones that they were trying to push and promote were the ones which were non-compliant in terms of our procurement procedures and in terms of our mandate.
Yes.
So they were offered the same opportunities on the same, more or less the same terms, because as I said, from a fairness perspective and from a competition perspective, we could not be seen to be favoring one entity over another.
Yes. Ordinarily, if they were not happy with the decision by whoever that and not to give them the other aspects, would there have been somebody else within SAA that they should have gone to ordinarily, or is that something that management would know?
I think it's something that management would know, Chairperson. So I'll just use my normal business experience, and that is that there's always a way in which things get bumped up. I think that even the fact that it went as far in the SAA processes, some of that was because there was questioning and contestation of it. But if I go to Woolworths to sell my lettuce leaves, there's always a process of appeals. At that stage, it had not even reached the desk of the CEO. You know, so there wasn't a due process. That was followed. But again, Chairperson, I speak under correction, and you should clarify this with management. And
am I right to think that effectively what the Director General was doing was to plead their case to you?
Yes, sir.
Yes. And did you regard that as appropriate?
No, I certainly did not regard it as appropriate. I thought it was inappropriate, but I was just quite irritated that I was being asked why I'm pulled out of my work to look at things that's really not my business. And in fact, I assured the DG that the broad principle of media diversity, for sure, entertaining a new entrant into our business, giving them some of our business, there were adequate processes, and they must exhaust those processes, that in fact it was inappropriate. I had no desire nor any legal standing to enter into discussions with them, so I communicated that I thought it was inappropriate.
And you said Mr. Mahlangu was there?
Yes, in fact, Mr. Mahlangu...
Did he play any important role at the meeting?
Yes, Mr. Mahlangu indeed did, and in fact was I can't even remember the details because, as I said, I ended the meeting quite
You were
soon.
upset about being
I was just, I
made
kept
to
on
stop
thinking,
what
why
you
am
are
I
doing.
here?
Yeah.
Why is the CEO even here? Because when the chairperson calls the CEO, she had to leave something. I know she was a little bit annoyed, but she came because the chairperson of the board felt that she should come.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hoffman?
Chair, I do note that we've gone slightly past the time of the lunch adjournment. If it's convenient, maybe we should take that now. There is the one final topic which I propose to address, which is the events leading up to the resignation of the board in September 2012 when we return.
How long do you think we might take on that one?
I think probably half an hour.
Yes.
To do it properly. I do need in that context to make reference to some of the further documents that we obtained from National Treasury in relation to the interactions between DPE and Treasury.
Yes.
So the better part of half an hour.
Oh, okay, maybe let's take the break. And I would have liked us to finish, but maybe we must wait and do it properly.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we'll take the lunch adjournment, and we will resume at 2:05. Thank you. We adjourn.
Thank you.